She studied with Gene Desfor at York University's Faculty of Environmental Studies, where she earned a master's degree in urban planning in 2005. She co-edited Reshaping Toronto's Waterfront with Gene Desfor and Transforming Urban Waterfronts with Desfor and other waterfront scholars. Both books were published in 2011. She currently works as a policy analyst at a community-based legal clinic that works to improve income adequacy and security for low-income people in Ontario. Please give Jean and Jennefer a warm Shellback welcome. Hi, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Gotta do a little talking so we can get used to what the sound is like. Can you hear me all right?
Yep.
Yeah, it's all good. Great. Well, sorry? Hey?
I don't have any.
Thank you very much for coming today. We're very pleased to be here to talk with you as you have your lunch about Toronto's waterfront. And thanks very much to Diane Leggett for inviting us to be with you. I think we did this talk a year ago at the, where were we? At the National Yacht Club. And Diane was in the audience and said, hey, you should come on down and talk to Shellbacks. So we said, sure, put us on the list. And we're happy to be here today. So you probably have gathered that I'm Jennefer and he's Gene. So we're happy to be here to tell you a story, our story, about the changing of Toronto's waterfront over the last 100 years or so. We worked together, as you've heard, on the fancy book that we have. It was, we actually won an award for it, so it was award-winning, but it wasn't exactly best-selling, but there you go. We kind of have it all. And that's okay. So the presentation that we have for you is based a lot on a lot of the work that we did in the book. I should tell you that it's an edited book, so there were a lot of different authors. We put together a few chapters, but a lot of the work was editing as well. So first off, just want to say that while we start our history at the beginning of the 20th century, we want to acknowledge that Toronto and its waterfront was the site of Indigenous settlement for a long time before that. And that the lands that we're talking about are the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, and the Métis, and we're grateful for the historic and current stewardship that they have had over these lands. And we also want to acknowledge the Archives of Ports Toronto, which used to be called the Harbour Commission. And they made available, and Jean will tell you about this, and you'll see a lot of this in the presentation, they made available a lot of documents, but particularly a lot of lantern slides and photographs that you're going to see today. And that's been very helpful. So, we're going to start off with this fancy map, which demonstrates, and I'll just scoot behind you. So you can see that, hopefully you can see this okay. The gray areas are all the areas that are fill, that weren't there before. So the map starts in, it compares 1834 to 1988, and you can see that, that most of the central waterfront in Toronto was constructed. And we're going to tell you about that, the processes behind which that construction happened. And that's why we called, so about 85, I should look at my notes, about 85% of Toronto's waterfront is actually constructed land. And that's why we called our presentation Walking on Water, because in effect we are walking on water as we, spend time on Toronto's waterfront. It recognizes the importance of lake filling and ties together a lot of diverse aspects of waterfront change. So our presentation, we're going to look at, firstly, the ways that waterfront, so, back when you can see that that's about Front Street there. So just basically everything south of Front was changed initially for a smokestack waterfront. Toronto used to be called the Big Smoke. And there was a lot of this kind of activity, and you'll see a lot of photographs of that today. And then how it was changed for this kind of waterfront, that we call kind of a pink umbrella waterfront. You know, if you've been down to Sugar Beach, you'll see the pink umbrellas. And so it's a very different kind of waterfront. And how did we get from there to here?
And many of the older photographs that we will see come from the archives of Ports Toronto, and that was previously called the Harbour Commission. And during our talk, we'll refer to it as the Harbour Commission rather than Ports Toronto. And many of the photos were made into lantern slides. And lantern slide has an image on a glass plate. And here we have a slide of two of those two lantern slides. It's made by taking a photographic negative, placing it on a glass that has light-sensitive chemicals on it, and that produces a photographic positive. Another piece of glass is put on top of that to protect the image, and then tape around the edges. And on these two slides, you can see that they were colored in with, hand-colored in with special inks. The slide is then projected onto a screen with these very awkward-looking machines that were called magic lanterns. And a magic lantern has a lens and a very strong light source. The lens makes it possible to project the image onto a screen. And the light source initially was a candle or an oil lamp, even a limelight or slate lime was used, and eventually electric bulbs were used. So in many ways, this is like an early a pre-Microsoft PowerPoint. Many of the images that we'll see today were taken by Arthur Beals. And Arthur Beals was a photographer that was hired full-time by the Harbour Commission in the summer of 1914. And he was one of the very few Canadian photographers who had artistic training before he became a photographer. And in his photographs, we'll see that, and now we are really the beneficiaries of that fantastic training that before he became a photographer. A lot of his photographs were made into lantern slides, and then put together by the Harbour Commission and used in something called an illustrated lecture. By the early part of the 20th century, around 1918, various civic groups in the city began to request the Harbour Commission to come and do talks about the progress that was being made in the development of the waterfront. And here in the first, one of the first instances of a communication from one of those groups I have here in 1921, and it is from the head of the Lions Club. And he said, the citizens of Toronto do not fully appreciate what a wonderful harbor they have at their doorstep, and they do not understand that it's been through your efforts, ability, and forethought that the plan originally dreamed of has been carried nearly to fruition. The Harbour Commission was not able to, or felt that it was not able to do those lectures at that time. There were a couple of issues going on, but by 1927, Edward Cousins, who was then the chief engineer of the Harbour Commission, he was able to write back and said, speaking on waterfront improvements in general is, to say the least, rather dry for a wet subject, and I have found that it is much more interesting for one's audience to use lantern slides. So we're going to be following Cousins' advice and using a lot of lantern slides. Here we have a list of those clubs to which these lectures were given. This was in 1932, so we have Masonic temple lodges, real estate boards, Home Builders Association, Ward 8 ratepayers, and you can read the rest there. And here is an example of the invitation that was sent out from the Ward 8 ratepayers, and it's clear that it's a free lecture with illustrated, with lantern slides. So the lantern slides were a big feature. And here we have an advertisement from the York Pioneer and Historical Association on December 15th. Brigadier General Langton, he was from the Harbor Commission, and he was talking about the Toronto Harbor improvements, illustrated.
So before we get to the lantern slides, let me just see here. So we're going to be showing you the lantern slides, but we're also going to be talking about how and why, obviously, the waterfront has changed so much. And we're going to look at three broad areas that had kind of an influence on change on the waterfront, but also were influenced by the change that was happening on the waterfront. And those three areas are the economy, so, all of the things that we do to produce goods and services, and not only the local things, but also things that are from out of the city. And so there was a lot going on both locally and out of the city that had an influence. The governance arrangements, so who got to decide? Who are these institutions? What are these institutions? Who had power to make decisions over the shape of the waterfront? And relationships between nature and the city. So the ways in which we interact with nature. I mean, the waterfront is an obvious place to be talking about those kinds of interactions because we've got water, we've got land, they come together. We, do a lot of different kinds of activities on them, on both of them. So the interaction between the city, the urban area, and its environment are part of the ways in which the waterfront changed.
And so now we're going to get into actually how things changed. Beginning in around the 20th century, the waterfront was thought of as a problem area that had three main aspects to it. The first problem was the economic growth, and the population of the city of Toronto was growing very quickly, and there needed to be a corresponding growth of the economy. And the way economies grew at that time was primarily through industrial activity. And there was thought to be a very great shortage of industrial sites for the location of this new manufacturing activity. And where would those sites be? Well, it was hoped that they would be on the waterfront. So there was a lack of adequate sites for new industry was one aspect of the problem. The second aspect was the problem of administration or management, or what was happening on the waterfront. Prior to the existence of the Toronto Harbor Commissioners, there was this body called the Harbor Trust, and that was really woefully inadequate. A lot of ship captains complained loudly about all kinds of objects that were floating in the harbor, the lack of sufficient depth, ships were going ashore. So and journalists would write about these shady land deals that were happening that where public interest was given preference over private profits. And the third part of the waterfront problem was the condition of Ashbridge's Bay Marsh. Now we would call it a wetland, but back then it was referred to as a swamp. And the swamp was really was described as a cesspool with all kinds of terrible conditions that existed there. It was written that there were unhealthy miasmas and foul temperaments, and Gooder and Warts, which was, we know, is a big distillery, And they used to take their waste from the cattle, from the waste from the making of their alcohol, and they took that corn mash and they would feed it to the cattle who were on the other side of the Don River. There was a big barn with a lot of cattle, and they would feed that mash to them. And the waste from the cattle went directly into Ashbridges Bay, and which you can imagine produced a really foul odor. Perhaps though even more important than the odor was the idea that swamp was an evil form of nature. And there were all kinds of unhealthy miasmas that existed there. And by and large, it was thought to be totally unproductive. And it needed to be made more productive. I think that the ideas about what nature is then and now are really significantly different. So those were the three aspects of the waterfront problem.
You may wish to just to point out to people that the beautiful grayish band running diagonally across the picture is not a precursor to the Gardner. It is in fact all railroad tracks with engines producing smoke, and none of those crossings are guarded. If we want to get from one side to the other, you're on your own, folks.
Right. There's a great slide of that, but I didn't include that now. But yeah.
One of the issues around the waterfront, certainly at that time, was access to the waterfront, right? I mean, it wasn't as though people could just run down there and launch their boats off the end of a pier, because that was all, a lot of it was taken up by economic activity. And that's not something that we cover in any great detail, but certainly access to the water was a big problem back then.
I thought you were referring to these stripes on the slide. And the reason for those stripes is, I don't want to really get into it, but I took this photograph of the lantern slides in the city archives, not from the Port's Toronto archives. And I had to take the photograph when the slide was on a light table. I don't know if you're familiar with a light table, but it's this glass thing, and underneath it has fluorescent tubes that illuminate whatever's on top of it. And unfortunately, this is where the fluorescent tubes were, and the darkness is where the tubes weren't. Anyway, enough. So, getting back to what happened with the waterfront. The way the problem was, the problems of the waterfront were solved principally by the establishment of the Harbor Commission. And the Harbor Commission was really quite unusual. It had quite an unusual mandate, an unusual composition, and an accountability framework. And it was more of a land development corporation than it was a harbor minding body. But 6 months after it was established, it came forward with its very important plan, the 1912 Waterfront Plan, that was used over the next decades, and that really dramatically changed the entire waterfront. So let me just talk briefly about some of the aspects of the plan. On the western part of the waterfront, we had, in Humber Bay, we had the regularization of the shoreline, and about 100 meters out in front of the shoreline was a seawall that provided a protected area for swimming and for crewing. And here began the Lakeshore Boulevard that wound all the way around across near where RCYC is, across the island, and ended up on the east side. That's one of the few aspects of this 1912 plan that never happened. Most of the plan really was completed. Here on the central part of the waterfront, that was the least well-defined area of what would happen there. And that was because there was a lot of existing industry, and the harbor commissioners weren't able to come to any agreement to what would happen. So the plan just evolved about what would go on there later on. But the guts of the whole plan is here on the eastern part of the waterfront, and that became the Portlands, Port Industrial District. And here we have a close-up view of that. And the reason that this was the key to the whole plan was because of the financing of the way the development project would be financed. And the idea that the commissioners had was that they would build this land, have industry come and locate on it. The new industry that would locate on it would then require shipping to bring in the inputs and to distribute their products. And the Harbor Commission would make enough money from their dockage fees in order to compensate for the enormous loans that they had to take out in order to produce the land. So that was the kind of economic logic of the way the plan would work. Okay, so here, what would be on the Port Industrial District is about 1,000 acres of land and water. You see the grid pattern of streets. The Don River comes down at a 90-degree angle and meets the Keating Channel. There's a ship channel here and a turning basin with some quays on the western edge, providing a lot of space for ships to dock. All the sites here would be provided with electricity and rail siding, so it was advertised as the most up-to-date, modern industrial area. On the southern border of the port lands was a system of lagoons, and that was added on towards the end of the development of the plan, and unfortunately, those lagoons never happened either. So, before the construction started, the condition of Ashbridges Bay Swamp was something like this. And there's this fantastic quotation from John Ross Robertson, who was the editor of the Tribune, and he said, perhaps sarcastically, Lake Ontario, whether it's liquid or solid, has always been reckoned among the assets of Toronto. So it really wasn't quite clear whether Ashbridges Bay was liquid or solid. Okay, so then the way that the land was constructed, first I'll talk about the building of the wall around the area. And here we have an an engineering drawing with these large timbers that were sunk down to bedrock, and on top of the wooden structure was filled in concrete and stones, and importantly there was a anchoring rod, steel anchoring rod that anchored the whole thing from the outside back to land, and that provided a great deal of stability for the walls and the pressure that would build up against these walls. So here's the first of Beale's slides, and I want to talk about sort of two categories of these slides. One is the aesthetic aspects of it, and the other is what we might call a point of view. So in terms of the aesthetics of this slide, and I think it's really a beautiful slide, absolutely gorgeous representation. And you have the very strong diagonal element in the background with these verticals of the worker, with the pile driver and the surveyor, the man holding up the surveying instruments, really focuses our attention down here. And if you look at it, everything is in focus, which is really quite an achievement with the cameras that they had at that time. So I think it's really a wonderful slide. Also, the smoke coming from the pile driver is an indication of industrial progress. It's not something that was, wasn't thought of as pollution. It was a sign of the modern economy. So in terms of the point of view, what is Beals and the Harbor Commission trying to show with this wonderful slide? Well, we have here we have a bold, very heroic image of the process of creating this new port industrial district. The transformation of land into water is seen as a process that's really audacious. It's a wonderful activity that's happening. And that is the way that the Harbor Commission wanted to tell its story, its history of how this land was transformed. In this slide, also of the construction of the ship channel, we have an interesting three sets of workers here. There are the people who are actually, the workers who are actually doing the work, and they would seem to all have their backs to the camera. Right? It's very strange that they have their backs to the camera. The gentleman with the pipe, I would guess he's a foreman. He's overlooking to see what's happening, but he's looking straight into the camera. And this gentleman over here on the left, the far left, I would guess he's the engineer who's overseeing everything that's happening there. So again, the point of view of this photograph, of this lantern slide, is that there's this great process that's being underway to transform the water into land. This slide has two lantern slides of the same photograph. And I wanted to show you this because of the difference between the black and white versus the tinting. Right? So here we have exactly the same photograph, but you can feel the difference that you have towards the slide when it's colored, hand-tinted versus the black and white.
Yes.
Yeah, this is a slide of the pouring concrete into the cribbing of the seawall. And so here you see the concrete that's coming down, and they're filling in the cribbing that had existed there. Sorry? Yeah. Here is another slide that has, again, two photographs, two lantern slides of the same photograph. This is also filling the pouring of the concrete into the seawalls, into the ship channel. Section KH, if you really want to know. This one is cropped a bit enlarged, but it's actually the same photograph. They were made from the same photograph. And what's interesting to me, one of the things that's interesting to me about this is we see the importance of the technician or the artist who's actually doing the tinting. Look at the skies, how different they are. The one on the left is got clouds in it and everything. The one on the right is a kind of a blue and gray coloring. And the timbers here are also a very different color than the timbers here. One of the strange things that happens in it when you enlarge it is that these pulleys, this mechanism for pouring the concrete, seem to be somehow strangely attached to the sky. So that's an unintended consequence of the enlargement. So my feeling about this is that we have to think about the authenticity of what's being produced. If we look at this one and this one, we ask ourselves, what's an authentic representation of the process of creating this land? And there is a lot of manipulation by the photographer, by the people who pay the photographer, the Harbor Commission, to create the kind of image that they want to create so that they can tell their story in that series of illustrated lectures. This slide is not one of Beale's. This was taken by Public Works Toronto, and here we seemingly have one of the officials, probably from Public Works, and he has got his foot up on the almost completed ship channel wall, and he seems to be taking possession of this wall, making it his. This is my ship channel wall. Here we have two of the dredges that were used. So behind these walls, there had to be some material that was brought in to create the land. And so what did that was these two dredges. The one on the left is the cyclone, the one on the right is the cyclone, and the Harbor Commission actually purchased that for this project. And it was said to be the largest dredge on the Great Lakes. The one on the right is the Shunia, and that was rented. It wasn't purchased. Now, in both of these cases, these huge propellers are lowered down to the bottom of the harbor, bottom of the lake, and they start turning around and churn up all kinds of stuff that's at the bottom of the harbor, and that is then, this sludge is then piped throughout the area to create the land. Yeah. So here we have really a very dramatic image of that piping, that system of pipes that moved the sludge from the bottom to where it was. Again, we have a worker here in the where the great divide between these pipes, and he's regulating the valve where the sludge is going to go. In this slide, again, the sludge is coming out of the pipe. I have a young boy here who seems to have 3 or 4 very large fish that he managed to catch. This is happening right where right around the ship channel. And in the background, there are a whole bunch of people. What are these people doing? Well, it's not really clear, but they're collecting all kinds of stuff that's coming out from the sludge. And one of the things I find really interesting is that you have an industrial process here with this massive amount of sludge coming through the pipes, and you have all kinds of people just hanging around. You know, I mean, what's going on? Clearly, that kind of intermingling of industrial processes and people wouldn't be happen now. Here in this lantern slide, again, this is a beautiful image, I think. It shows the enormity of the project that's being undertaken. These timbers, these very large timbers, were from British Columbia and shipped all the way across the country to be used. The pile driver is there. I mean, this is a great, bold, heroic image that the Harbor Commission is using. This gentleman here with his bowler hat is likely to be Edward Cousins, that chief engineer. He was known to he wore that kind of a bowler hat all the time. So that is likely him. And this person over here on on your left, to me, he looks like that engineer that we saw supervising earlier on in the earlier slide. This is kind of a humorous slide, I think. Clearly posed, carefully posed, with a worker who is riding on the concrete caps that are used in the seawall in the western part of the waterfront. He's taking a ride with this huge crane, and his fellow workers on the left are looking as though they're quite enjoying watching him doing this, taking the ride. So I think that this was a carefully posed photograph. One, again, that the Harbor Commission wanted to use to create its story of the waterfront change. And also this was clearly done before there were any health and safety regulations about work. One of the aspects of doing these illustrated lectures was the power to select, an editorial power, which photographs are included and which photographs never make it. Here we have 2 photographs that never became lantern slides. And I think it's clear why they never became lantern slides, and they were never included in these illustrated histories. On the right, we have the workers who were digging the foundation for the British forging plant in 1917, and on the left, they're digging the foundation for the Harbor Commission building also in 1917. And here we have these workers who are up to their thighs, up to their calves in mud, a very dirty, unpleasant scene. This was not the image that the Harbor Commission wanted to convey in when it constructed its history of the waterfront. To me, it looks like these workers are largely from Southern Europe or Eastern Europe, and it's a very unheroic image. So this power, editorial power, is very important in the creation of the history. So now I want to talk a bit about the uses to which the land was put. Coal was a very important fuel source up until the Second World War. Coal was used not only for the heating of residential buildings, but also office buildings. It was the fuel for ships, and it was also used in the streetcars for heating. So here we have the image of these boats that are fueling up at Ashbridges Bay dock. Much of the land on the Portlands was used for coal storage and coal processing. This is another really a beautiful image of of coal storage, and with the Bascule Bridge in the background. Here we have the piles of various coal, and importantly, there is the railway siding here that gives evidence of the way that each one of the extent to which the rail network reached out on the Portlands.
Excuse me, is that bridge, is that the bridge which is there now?
Yes, that's the bridge on Cherry Street Bridge. That's the same Bascule Bridge on Cherry Street. Exactly. We'll see another picture of it when it's open. So beginning in the 1930s or so, there was some controversy about the extent to which the Harbor Commission had been successful in having new industry locate up on the waterfront and the port industrial area. So what did they do? The Harbor Commission started taking photographs of the industry that was there. So here we have Baldwin Steel, McCall Frontenac, Imperial Oil, and the Canadian Ice Machine Company. So this was visual evidence of the presence of industry out on the Port Industrial District, and that was important for the purposes of the Harbor Commission. This is one of my favorite slides. It's also part of that series of corporations that were located out on the Portlands. Here we have the headquarters of the office building from Sun Oil Company. It's a tremendously flat image, and I can just see, I can hear the ragtime music and Faye Dunaway and Warren Beatty, who were Bonnie and Clyde, jumping out of this car with their Tommy guns blazing. So to me, it's really a wonderful image. Here we have a slide of the Harbor Commission in the central part of the waterfront. And in this slide, while maybe it's not so clear, but the Harbor Commission building is actually complete, but the land around it has not yet been filled in. So we see the outline of land that will be filled in. The irony, of course, of this slide is that from the Harbor Commission building, you can't even see the water now. And it may not be the Harbor Commission building for too much longer. It's been sold. So here we have another great slide. This one is a cribbing that was to be used for the building of the seawall in the western part of the waterfront. Again, the massive size of this project is obvious. The timbers, these are the same timbers that are shipped from British Columbia. You can see how large everything is and the relative size of the people who are working versus the timber. These cribs were built near Harborfront, and then they were launched into the lake and tugged out to the western waterfront, and then sunk with rocks and concrete, and then those caps that we saw earlier were put on top. So this is the cribbing that formed the basis for the seawalls of the western waterfront. Our talk really wouldn't be fair if we didn't mention Sunnyside. Sunnyside was not part of that 1912 plan, but it came along shortly thereafter. This is the entrance to the bathing pavilion. The architect for this was the same architect, Chapman, who did the gates to the CNE. And here on the left, we see how popular Sunnyside was. The cars are lined up one behind the other, bum, 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 and all the people on the waterfront. So Sunnyside was extremely popular on a sunny day. This is the bathing pavilion. Again, images of how popular it was.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, where's the horseshoe?
I don't know if anybody here actually went to the bathing pavilion. Was anybody fortunate enough? Yeah, did you?
No, the dive is
Okay. Here we have, two lantern slides made from the same photograph. And the one on the right, again, is enlarged and cropped. You don't really see the sky very much in this one. The reason, one of the main points I want to make, other than, here's Sunnyside, here's all the people having a great time on a sunny day. Again, the importance of that technician or artist in doing the coloring. Well, we can't see too much, but in fact, there is a difference between the coloring of the tent here and the coloring of the tent there. And we don't really know whether whether that tent was yellow and red. It probably was the imagination of the technician who did it. And whether this woman's dresses were blue and whether the bathing suit was red and green. We don't know whether that's an authoritative representation of what actually existed in 1921. But they sure are beautiful and they sure are great slides. Here we have a booze cruise or a tourist boat in the 1930s, the Dalhousie City. And again, here in the background is the opening of the Bascule Bridge on Cherry Street. So the Dalhousie City is entering into the ship channel. And here we see the enormous amount of smoke that's coming from the chimney of the ship. And again, that's an indication of progress. That's not air pollution that they're looking at. And the amount of smoke makes me a little bit suspicious. Maybe the artist, the technician who was doing the tinting, enhanced that to give a better impression of the amount of progress that's being made with these slides.
So another little bit of what wasn't included in the Harbor Commission's 1912 plan is, of course, the island airport. You may know that the airport started actually in the First World War when seaplanes were flying out of the harbor, and it progressed over the next 20 years or so to the use of the Toronto Waterfront for air travel progressed over the next 20 years to both be seaplanes flying out of the harbor, but also airplanes flying off the land that was constructed. Here we've got, oh, sorry, I'll go back. Oh, there we go. So here we've got a slide of the seaplane Santa Maria in front of the Harbor Commissioner's building, and again, as Jean was showing us from the slide earlier, the harbor, you can't see the water from there anymore. And all of that water that you see is now land. And there's lots of giant buildings on it as the financial district progresses south. And of course, then we've got, this is now, so that's in the water. This is of course on the land that was constructed to be the island airport. And that's a great shot from 1969 of the Toronto building. So here we've got a bit of a before and after shot. In 1937, we already had the seawalls built, but the plans for the airport were approved in 1937, and it took them only 2 years to actually build the airport. As you can see here, the land again was built using the same process that Jean talked about earlier, which is the building of walls, and then you dredge up the muck from the bottom of the lake and you pipe it in behind the walls. So you can see here that, so it was something like, I'm going to check my notes, something like 2 million cubic yards of material was sucked out of the blockhouse bay right there and deposited to finish the construction of the land. And then back on the other side of the harbor, we've got a shot of the Port Industrial District, so now it's called the Portlands, in the 1930s, and you can see that the ship channel had already been built, but a lot of the quays hadn't been constructed yet. So this is still kind of a natural area that doesn't have walls around it, which is interesting. So where are we? So Gene showed us the huge amount of heroic work that the Harbour Commission would want you to understand as heroic work that it took to build a lot of the waterfront over the first many decades of the 20th century. So after all of that work, what did Toronto have to show for it? Well, you know, there was already consternation in the 30s. The waterfront, in particular this Port Industrial District, never really lived up to its potential or to what the builders of the land at the Harbour Commission wanted it to be. While there was the oil tank storage and the coal processing and the steel and gas companies that Gene showed us earlier, as well as grain elevators, which you've seen down there, I'm sure, and there was also a whole lot of ship construction that we haven't talked about here. Only about 30% of the available land was used for industry. And by the late 1960s, the industry that was there was starting to be in serious decline as the sort of shape of Toronto's economy changed. So it was either shutting down completely, or it was just moving to a different part of the city. The port was becoming less and less important as shipping was on the decline as well. You know, now we just take everything off of the ship that it comes to us from, wherever it's come from, stick it on a truck, and ship materials in that way. So shipping was on the decline. The structure of the economy was changing, and then as that happened, the land then became available for other uses. And I love this quote from Ken Greenberg, who used to be he wasn't the head planner, he was head of urban design at City of Toronto for many years. And in an academic paper that he wrote in 1996, he called the waterfront at that time a terrain of availability. It was a place where new land uses could be envisioned. It was also a place for new decision making, but it was and a place for new ideas about the waterfront, what the waterfront could be. So, you know, there had been many, many years of everyone thinking that the waterfront was all about industry and shipping. Well, now we've got all this land that's available. What are we going to do with it? So a very interesting time over the next several decades in figuring out what the waterfront was going to be for, who got to decide, and what the shape of it was going to be. So again, getting to the end of the 20th century, we had a similar set of questions and problems that we had at the beginning of the 20th century. First, and they all revolve around this nexus of economy, governance, and nature. While the waterfront was this terrain of availability, the land was zoned for industrial uses. There were a lot of politicians at the time, so this is in the 60s, 70s, 80s, who wanted to see that land preserved for industrial uses because, good jobs, good, well-paying, family-supporting jobs. And the Port Authority, the Harbour Commission, continued to insist that, oh, well, the port's going to rebound. Shipping's going to be good. It'll be fine. No worries. And so we're going to need to continue to have a lot of land for port-related uses. Secondly, there was a lot of frustration about the Harbour Commission, in much the same way as there had been frustration over the Harbour Trust. A lot of debate among city officials, provincial and federal government, the Harbour Commission, and the general public. I mean, there had been a lot of land sales that the public wasn't happy about over what would happen and who would decide, so we've got this kind of jurisdictional gridlock, a lot of decision makers over the same land. And third, the problem again of nature, so the land had been constructed and then a lot of, industrial activity had taken place on it, and that contaminated the land. So we have another problem of, now a polluted kind of nature. And so it was important to figure out how to deal with that. But it was difficult because there was a lot of uncertainty about who had to do the cleanup, who was responsible for it, how much it would cost, what the rules were. And there was also a question about what to do about the Don River. Because as you'll recall, in 1955 with Hurricane Hazel, there was a threat of, we had to plan for what would happen if there was another 100-year flooding event, and particularly on the Don River in this instance, because if the Don overflows its banks, then a lot of the downtown area would be in jeopardy. So how were all these problems resolved? There was a lot of work that happened between about 1980 and about 2000. And I'm not going to get into all the details, but I want to point out 4 kind of major changes that happened that propelled us from the industrial waterfront into what we can now look at as a sort of a post-industrial waterfront. So first was, you may remember that Toronto's tiny perfect mayor, David Crombie, headed up the Royal Commission on the Future of the Toronto Waterfront in the 1980s. That was a very important process in terms of waterfront change because it seriously weakened the power of the Harbour Commission, so got past the problem of jurisdictional gridlock. The Royal Commission recommended that, so the Harbour Commission had control over almost all of the lands that it had constructed. And the Commission recommended that those lands be given over to a city agency, and only a little bit left over for the Harbour Commission to have its port activities on, and you know where that is on the Port Industrial District, I'm sure. This commission also promoted what it called an ecosystem approach to planning. You'll recall that in the 80s there was a lot of concern about the environment, a lot of talk about the natural environment and about ecosystems and about the need for natural habitats. So it coined this term, an ecosystem approach to urban planning, and said that the city needed what it called green infrastructure. Well, that's like parks. It's another word for parks, for naturalized areas, for habitat areas. I love this idea of renaturalizing nature. Right? There was a lot of discussion at the time of that we're gonna build some new nature. Let's have some nature. We need nature, so let's build some. And it kind of harkens back to what Jean was talking about the the heroic construction of the waterfront in the first place, right? Like, we're engineers and we can do all these things. It's very interesting. So we're going to make some new nature. Now this green infrastructure would provide for mitigating the flooding threat, taking the river back to a more natural habitat for animals and for the rest of us. And it also talked about the need for green enterprise, so a move away from industrial activity that was polluting to the kind of economic activity that wouldn't leave the same kind of negative footprint. Second were a bunch of changes to provincial cleanup rules. The province changed the rules in 1996 that gave certainty to how we had to clean up the land. So it also gave certainty about financial liability, so who was liable and how clean the land had to be at the end of the day. So that made things much more certain and much less costly. Third, there was this process that the city undertook called unlocking the portlands, and this was about looking at the zoning regulations in the area. I know that we're kind of getting into pointy-headed detail, but this process was really important to getting rid of sort of the industrial hegemony on the waterfront. It acknowledged the need for new land uses. It proposed new zoning bylaws so that you could do other things other than just have industry on the waterfront. And it recommended a green corridor of parks and natural areas. I'm sure that you're seeing a pattern here now, right? Like, we've got some really important and interesting resolutions to the problems that were identified earlier. The last process, of course, was the Olympics. You may recall again that there was a 1996 bid in the City of Toronto for the 2008 Summer Olympics, which ended up going to Beijing. But the bid proposed that the Olympics be sited on the Port Industrial District, the Central Waterfront, the Western Waterfront, and so this was a great, there's a whole field of study around how large-scale sporting events can transform urban areas. And they do that even if you don't win the bid. Like, even if you don't get the Olympics happening, there's a lot of activity that happens, even around a losing bid, that can really change the shape and the idea of what the land is for. And so what this did was it created the conditions in which Toronto and its decision makers started thinking about the waterfront as something, they called it the front porch to the world. We were going to invite the world, and so we had to have a fancy waterfront in order to have them want to come. It brought together the 3 levels of government to invest in cleanup of the lands. So each government proposed $500 million to clean up the land. And in doing so, it was really important. So then we get a question of like who gets to decide and what are the institutions that are created to do the decision making. The rules of Olympic bids, it's very interesting. The rules of Olympic bids of the IOC say that you can't spend money out of the Olympic bid to do things like build parks and clean up the land. You can't do that through the bid. Somebody else has to do that. So what they did was they created a new agency in order to do that. And that was what you might know as Waterfront Toronto. It used to be called, when it was first set up in 2001, it was called the Toronto Waterfront Revitalization Corporation. And it came directly out of the Olympic bid to do the work of cleaning up the waterfront and providing for the new idea for what the waterfront was supposed to be. It had a mandate to advance what they called the 21st century waterfront at the time. And the point was to use the public money that had been pledged to clean up the land, build the new parkland, and undertake planning for the new uses. It had support from all the three levels of government, so it could negotiate between the levels and get rid of this problem of jurisdictional gridlock. And it got the politicians, interested in like cutting ribbons and kissing babies and like hoisting shovels and photo ops and all that good stuff. It's like, yay, we're building a new waterfront, and all of the politicians are on board. And so, that provides the momentum to get the job done. And to, believe in this new vision for a 21st century waterfront, and while we didn't get the bid, while we didn't get the Olympics, we still have the vision. And that vision is really well encapsulated in these couple of quotes. This first quote talks about the need for the waterfront to be reshaped for beautiful parks and public spaces, to establish new residential communities, to create space for a knowledge-based economy, and redefine Toronto and, in fact, the entire country on the world stage. So no longer would Toronto be like the Pittsburgh of Canada, it would, or the Pittsburgh of the North, as in the steel days. It would be the San Francisco, tech hub of the North, or the Barcelona of Canada. And this second quote shows that the point of waterfront redevelopment in this period was about creating a vibrant, high quality of life to attract the kind of brightest and best who would come here and engage in new economic activity. So you heard about the economic logic of the harbor commissioners when they were building the land initially. The economic logic of the 21st century waterfront goes like this. You take the money, you invest it in the public money, you invest it in green infrastructure, so parks and public spaces and cleaning up the land. You do it, and this is all in the zones from west to east. They kind of rolled this out across the waterfront west to east. You create, at the same time that you're doing the cleanup, you create plans, so what they call precinct plans, for how the lands should be used and what should be on them, how big the buildings should be, what the buildings should look like. Particularly with community input. Community input has been a big part of waterfront redevelopment in this very recent period. And with ideas about environmental sustainability on the lands. Then you sell the land, so you've built a bunch of new parks, you've got certainty about what's going to go on the lands, the value of the land increases by virtue of that process. You sell the land to private developers, and they agree, and you make some money that way. They agree to build what you've planned. The profits then from the land sales go into the next area, right? So you got, from the profits from selling off land in Zone 1 goes into building parks in Zone 2. And there we go. It rolls all the way across. So what do we see on this new waterfront? Well, you probably recognize a lot of this. We see new green infrastructure, and a great example is the reconfiguration of Queens Quay Boulevard. The idea is creating one of the world's most beautiful waterfront boulevards. All of this idea about the world, right? Like now we're on the world stage. We've got a new transit alignment, space for walking. We've got all these new trees, the motifs of the North and Algonquin Park and maple leafs and all that good stuff. We see other kinds of green infrastructure like Sugar Beach, a lovely place to go and have a nice time on a sunny day. Sugar and Common Park, which is this one over here. I don't know if you've been down there, but this is a really interesting feature that they built. It's not only a lovely kind of fountain that has an artistic quality to it, but it's also a water treatment facility for the local area. So you've got both, the aesthetics and the sort of natural